Somewhere in a museum storage room, sitting in a climate-controlled drawer, there is a small piece of ochre, red, roughly the size of your thumb. Someone ground it down deliberately. You can see the wear marks. You can see where fingers held it, pressed it against something, and drew. That piece of ochre is approximately 100,000 years old. It is not writing. It is not language. It is not a message in any form we can decode. And yet, someone made it. Someone chose that color. Someone decided that marking a surface mattered enough to spend time on. Here is what stops me every time I think about this. Between that moment, a hand pressing red pigment into a surface in a cave in South Africa, and the first clay tablet pressed in Mesopotamia around 3,300 BCE, there are roughly 97,000 years. 97,000 years of human life. Of people waking up, eating, loving, grieving, teaching their children, burying their dead, looking at the sky, and wondering. And almost none of it left a readable mark. That silence is what this is about. Not the writing we have, but the 100,000 years before anyone pressed a wedge into wet clay and made something a stranger could one day read. What were people doing in that silence? What did they know? What did they remember? What did they lose? And what does it mean that we come from them? That their minds were our minds, and we can barely hear them at all? If you're settling in for the night, that's exactly why I make these. Let the question carry you. Here is a question that sounds simple until you sit with it. How do you remember something you cannot write down? Not a shopping list, not a phone number, something that actually matters, where the safe water is when the dry season comes, which plant, if you eat it raw, will kill you in hours, what the sky looks like 3 days before a flood. These are not abstract questions. For most of human history, getting them wrong meant dying. And yet for 97,000 years, there was no clay. No ink, no surface that could hold the answer after the person who knew it was gone. The first thing to understand is that memory before writing was not inferior. It was different, structured differently, stored differently, transmitted differently. When modern researchers spend time with communities that still maintain strong oral traditions, they find something surprising. People can recite genealogies going back 30 generations. They can describe the location of water sources across hundreds of kilometers of landscape they may never have personally visited. They can reconstruct star patterns, seasonal cycles, migratory routes of animals with a precision that takes trained scientists years to verify. This is not magic. This is what a mind looks like when it has been trained since childhood to hold the world inside itself. But oral memory has a shape. It prefers rhythm. It prefers repetition. It prefers story. Information that survives across 10 generations is almost never a dry list of facts. It is a song, a ritual, a warning wrapped in a myth about a monster that lives near the bad water. The monster is not real. The bad water is. And for 97,000 years, that was enough. The question is not whether it worked. The question is what it felt like to live inside a world where everything you needed to know lived only in the voices of the people around you. And what happened when those voices went silent. There is a researcher who spent years living with Aboriginal communities in Australia. She was studying oral traditions, memory systems, the way knowledge travels without paper. One evening, sitting around a fire, she asked an elder how old a particular story was. The elder thought for a moment. Then she said something that stopped the researcher completely. She said the story described a time when the sea was much further away, when the coastline was different, when there was land where there is now only water. The researcher went home and checked the geological record. She found that the coastline the story described had last existed approximately 10,000 years ago. The story had been accurate. For 10,000 years. Passed mouth to mouth, fire to fire, generation to generation without losing its essential truth. This is what fire did for 97,000 years. Not warmth, not cooking, not protection from predators, though it did all of those things. Fire was the gathering place of everything a group knew. Every evening, when the light failed and the world contracted to the radius of the flame, the library opened. Stories were told. Songs were sung. Names were recited. Routes were described. Warnings were repeated. A child sitting at the edge of that circle was not being entertained. They were being loaded. Slowly and deliberately, across hundreds of evenings, across years of sitting and listening, they were receiving the accumulated knowledge of every person who had sat at that fire before them. And before that fire. And before that. Back and back and back, through generations we will never be able to name. The library had no building. It had no catalog, no shelves, no index. Its volumes were people. And like any library, it was vulnerable. A bad winter, a disease moving through a group, a conflict that split a band and separated the person who knew the river crossings from the person who knew the plants. Entire chapters could disappear between one generation and the next. Not dramatically, not in flames, just quietly. In the space between one person's last breath and a child who was born just a little too late to hear it. That is the library that sustained us for 97,000 years. Fragile, extraordinary, and almost entirely invisible to us now. Before clay, before ink, before any surface that could outlast the person who marked it, there was skin. We know this not from written records, obviously. We know it from bodies. The oldest tattooed human remains we have found belong to Otzi the Iceman, a man who died somewhere in the Alps around 3,300 BCE. His body was preserved by ice for more than 5,000 years. When researchers examined him, they found 61 tattoos. Not decorative in any obvious way. Not symbols of status in any way we can clearly read. Most of them are simple. Lines, crosses, small clusters of marks placed precisely on joints and pressure points that correspond closely to areas of his body that showed signs of arthritis and chronic pain. The working theory is that they were therapeutic, that someone pressed pigment into his skin not to make him beautiful but to mark where the pain was, or where to press, or where to apply heat. His body was a medical record, written in a language we are still trying to read. But Otzi is not the beginning. He is just the oldest we happen to have preserved. Archaeological evidence suggests body modification of various kinds. Ochre on skin, scarification, piercing, tattooing, goes back much further. Ochre has been found in burial sites dating to 100,000 years ago. Pierced shells that could only have been used as personal ornaments appear in the record at least 130,000 years ago. Someone wore those shells. Someone chose them, drilled holes in them, hung them from their body, and walked through the world marked. We do not know what the marking meant. That is the honest answer. We can speculate. Status, group membership, ritual protection, a signal to strangers about who you were and where you came from. All of those are plausible. None of them are proven. What we can say is that the impulse to turn the body itself into a surface, to make skin speak when there were no other surfaces available, that impulse is as old as anything we can trace in the human record. Think about what that means. For tens of thousands of years, before anyone pressed a mark into clay, the primary text of human civilization was the human body. You looked at a person and you read them. The marks on their skin told you things that took years of context to understand. Which group they belonged to, what they had survived, what role they played in the community, what knowledge they carried. A body was a library that walked, and when that person died, the library closed. No copy survived. No backup existed. The text simply ended with the last breath of the person who carried it. That is the world before writing. Not primitive, not simple, just written on surfaces that could not outlast their authors. In 1994, 3 speleologists were exploring a cliff face in the Ardèche region of France. They found a narrow opening, barely wide enough to squeeze through. They went in anyway. What they found inside has not stopped being discussed since. The walls were covered. Not scratched, not smeared. Covered. Horses in motion. Rhinoceroses facing each other. Lions hunting. A panel of aurochs so carefully rendered that modern artists have studied them for technique. The cave is now called Chauvet. The paintings are approximately 36,000 years old. Not the oldest cave art we have, but among the most sophisticated. And here is the thing that should make you pause. The people who made them did not live there. There are no hearths in the painted chambers, no food remains, no signs of extended habitation. People went in, made the images, and left. They were not decorating a home. They were doing something else entirely. To reach some of the painted chambers in caves like Chauvet, like Lascaux, like Altamira, you have to go deep, not a few meters, hundreds of meters into the earth, through passages so narrow your shoulders scrape the walls, down drops where you have to lower yourself on your arms and hope the floor is where you think it is. In absolute darkness, the only light whatever you carried with you, animal fat in a stone lamp, a torch of twisted grass, enough to see a few meters ahead. No more. Now think about what it takes to bring pigment, bring tools, bring enough light to work by, and go that far in. You planned this. You prepared for it. You knew what you were going for. This was not a casual act. This was an expedition into the body of the earth, into darkness that most humans would find unbearable even today with modern equipment. Something was worth that journey. Something was worth the darkness. We do not know what. That is the honest answer, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. There are theories, teaching, ritual, initiation, communication with spirits, a record of migrations and seasonal patterns encoded in animal images. Some researchers believe the deep chambers were chosen precisely because they cut you off from the ordinary world. No sky, no wind, no sound except your own breathing and the drip of water somewhere in the dark. In that stillness, the boundary between the everyday and whatever lay beyond it might feel thinner. Whatever the purpose, the result is the oldest archive we can walk into. Not a building, not a shelf. A hole in the earth that has kept its contents for 36,000 years simply by being cold, dark, and sealed. The information inside is still there. We just cannot fully read it yet. There is a place in northern Australia called Murujuga. On its rocks, spread across an area the size of a city, there are approximately 1 million engravings. 1 million. Animals that no longer exist in that region. Plants that have not grown there for thousands of years. Figures performing rituals we cannot name. Symbols whose meaning has not been transmitted to anyone alive today. The oldest of them may be 50,000 years old. The newest were made within living memory. This is not a single archive. It is a palimpsest. A surface written on again, by people who were themselves responding to what was already there. Some of what was already there they understood. Some of it they were guessing at just as we are now. The forgetting did not wait for writing to arrive. It was already happening. Slowly, continuously. As it always does when the only storage medium is human memory. Here is what we know about how oral memory fails. It does not fail all at once. It fails at the edges first. The specific details go. The exact name of the person who first discovered that particular plant combination. The precise route through the mountain pass that no one has used for 3 generations. The full version of the song that was only ever known by one specialist in one community who died without a student. The core survives longer. The lesson. The warning. The general shape of the story. But over centuries, even the core drifts. Places shift in the telling. Numbers grow. Time frames compress or expand. The specific becomes general. The general becomes mythic. The mythic becomes the only version anyone knows, and at some point, no one alive remembers that it was ever anything else. This is not failure. This is how oral transmission works. It preserves what matters most to the people doing the remembering. The problem is that what mattered most to them is not always what matters most to the people who come after. We know there were extinctions, not just of animals, of knowledge. When the last speaker of a language dies, every word that existed only in that language dies with them. Every concept that could only be expressed in that particular arrangement of sounds. Every story that was only ever told in that tongue. Gone, not destroyed, not burned, just no longer transmitted. There are researchers today who estimate that a language dies approximately every 2 weeks, each one taking with it a way of dividing the world that existed nowhere else. Before writing, the rate was probably higher. A bad winter, a disease, a conflict, one small community scattered or destroyed. And with it, everything that community had spent generations carefully remembering. The 97,000 years of silence is not empty. It is full of things we will never know were there. Somewhere in southern Mesopotamia, around 3300 BCE, someone faced a problem. Not a philosophical problem, not a spiritual one, a logistical one. The city of Uruk had grown beyond what any single mind could hold. Tens of thousands of people, hundreds of transactions every day, grain coming in from dozens of different fields, labor pools assigned to different tasks, animals moving between different handlers, finished goods flowing out to distant trading partners. No single person could remember all of it. No group of people sitting around a fire could keep track of all of it through story and song. The scale had exceeded the capacity of oral memory, and so someone, we will never know who, picked up a piece of wet clay, pressed a reed into it, and made a mark that stood for a quantity of grain, not a picture of grain, not a story about grain, a mark that meant a specific amount, in a specific location, on a specific day. This is not how we like to imagine the invention of writing. We want it to be poetic, a visionary sitting under stars, deciding to capture the beauty of language for future generations, a priest encoding sacred knowledge so it would survive beyond their lifetime, a poet who wanted their words to outlast them. The reality is a receipt, barley, numbers, a storage location, a date. That is what the oldest secure writing we have found actually says, not a prayer, not a myth, not a poem, an inventory. And yet, in that inventory, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in 97,000 years of human life on Earth, a thought existed outside a human mind, not in a voice that would fade, not on a body that would die, on a surface, pressed into clay that would dry and harden and last, a thought that could outlive the person who thought it. We tend to think of this as a beginning, the beginning of history, the beginning of civilization, the beginning of everything that matters, but it might be more accurate to think of it as a threshold. On one side, 97,000 years of human beings living entirely inside the present. Every piece of knowledge held in a living mind, every memory dependent on a living voice, every story one death away from disappearing. On the other side, the possibility of a different kind of permanence, not immortality. Clay breaks, libraries burn, languages die even when they are written down. But something had changed. The thought and the thinker had been separated, for the first time. After 97,000 years of being inseparable, that separation is what writing is, not letters, not grammar, not literature, the gap between a mind and its contents, a gap that everything we call civilization has been built inside. There is a philosopher named Socrates who never wrote anything down. This was not an accident. It was a position. He believed that writing would damage memory, that if you could write something down, you would stop truly knowing it. You would have the appearance of knowledge without the substance, a reference instead of an understanding. His student Plato recorded this argument in a dialogue called Phaedrus. The irony is obvious. We only know what Socrates thought about writing because someone wrote it down. But the argument itself is worth sitting with because there is evidence that Socrates was right. Not completely right. Not right enough to justify abandoning writing, but right in a way that we have mostly stopped noticing. When you write something down, you do remember it less well. This has been tested, repeatedly, in controlled conditions. The act of externalizing a memory reduces the pressure on the mind to retain it. The library starts doing the work the mind used to do, and the mind, relieved of that work, gradually loses the capacity for it. Pause 3 seconds. 12:58 to 13:38, Block B. But it goes deeper than memory. Before writing, knowledge was not a thing you possessed. It was a thing you were. The person who knew which plants were safe did not have that information stored somewhere they could look up. They were that knowledge. It lived in their hands and their eyes and the particular way they moved through a landscape. It was inseparable from who they were. When writing arrived, knowledge became something different, something that could be separated from its knower, stored, copied, transferred, lost by one person and found by another. This is an enormous gain, The accumulated knowledge of every civilization that learned to write did not die when those civilizations died. It survived. In fragments, in copies of copies, in translations of translations. We are reading it now. But something was also lost. The particular way of knowing that comes from carrying knowledge inside your body. From having learned it not from a text, but from a person who learned it from a person who learned it from a person going back further than anyone could name. That kind of knowing has a texture that written knowledge does not have. It is slower, harder to transfer, impossible to copy. And once a community stops transmitting it in the old way, it does not survive in writing. Because it was never the kind of thing that could be written down. Pause 3 seconds. 1340 to 1345. Block C. We gained something extraordinary. The ability to remember across time and distance, to build on what came before, to speak to people we will never meet. But we also stepped away from something, a particular kind of presence, of being fully inside the world you were trying to understand, not reading about the river. Being in the river, knowing the river the way your hands knew it, not studying the stars, living under them, season after season, until their movements were as familiar as the breathing of the person sleeping next to you. The 97,000 years of silence were not a lack. They were a different kind of fullness. One we can barely imagine now, and one we should probably think about more carefully than we do. Go back to that piece of ochre in the museum drawer, red, thumb-sized, 100,000 years old. We still don't know what it was used for exactly. Body paint, a ritual object, a marker of identity, a medicine, all of those at once, none of those. Something we don't have a category for. The honest answer is that we don't know. And that not knowing is not a failure of archaeology or science or human intelligence. It is a measurement of distance between us and the person who held that ochre, who chose that color, who pressed it against something and left a mark that has lasted 100,000 years. That distance is real. We cannot cross it entirely, but we can stand at the edge of it and feel its size. And feeling its size is itself a kind of knowledge. The knowledge that we are not the first version of this, that before us, for longer than we usually think about, there were people doing the work of being human, carefully, thoughtfully, with everything they had. Here is what I keep coming back to. The silence is not behind us, it is still here. Right now, in this moment, most of what it means to be human is not written down anywhere. The way your grandmother moved through a kitchen, the particular tone your father used when he was trying not to show he was worried, the exact feeling of a specific summer when you were young and the world felt a certain way that it has never quite felt since. None of that is in any archive. None of that will survive you in any written form. It will pass the way everything passed for 97,000 years, from person to person, voice to voice, presence to presence, or it will not pass at all. And this is not a tragedy. It is what it has always been. The written record is the surface of human experience. The depth is still oral, still embodied, still living only in the spaces between people who are present with each other. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, you are doing something your ancestors did for 97,000 years. You are letting a voice in the dark carry knowledge into your mind. Not from a page, from a person, or something close enough to a person to feel that way in the quiet. The oldest technology we have. Older than clay, older than ochre. As old as language itself. A voice. The dark. And someone willing to listen. That's all it ever was. That's all it needed to be. If this kept you company tonight, I'd love to know where you are and what time it is there. Someone in Almaty just before dawn. Someone in London drifting off at midnight. Someone somewhere I've never imagined hearing the same silence I'm trying to describe. Leave a comment if you feel like it. I read everyone. And if you want to go deeper into these quiet corners of human prehistory, there is more waiting for you here. Good night.